$1 trillion. That's the number President Donald Trump announced for US military spending in 2026. It's a record-shattering figure. Announced at the beginning of April during a press event alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Trump delivered it with his signature bravado. "Nobody has seen anything like it. We are getting a very, very powerful military." While the number itself is eye-popping, the real question is, what does a $1 trillion military budget actually buy? More importantly, what does it change? And perhaps even most importantly, is the figure actually realistic? Stick around to find out. Let's start with the basics, which is the announcement in question. Trump seemed to offer the budget as a lifeline for the US international and internal security concerns. While the president hasn't singled out any entity or event that brought about this significant increase, it's fairly clear that this stems from the ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, war in Ukraine, the US-Mexico border and cartel crisis, and the ongoing political struggle between the US and China to take the top spot as the world's only superpower. With that in mind, the only thing that needs to be done with such an unspecific declaration is to dig deeper into the history of the US military budget, starting with the ongoing year. The current US defense budget passed for fiscal year 2025 under the previous President Joe Biden's administration sits at $849 billion, according to an announcement from the Department of Defense in March 2024. Trump's proposed budget would be a 12% jump, a scale of increase the Department of Defense hasn't seen since 1982. While Trump hasn't provided an itemized breakdown, history tells us that the Pentagon typically spends its money. In fact, the entire budget is itemized and publicly available directly for the government, listed under Function 050 of the federal budget. And that history, paired with recent trends, gives us a good lens to extrapolate what this $1 trillion expenditure would buy. But it's important to note that the $849 billion figure is slightly misleading. In fact, the federal budget listed under Function 050 is considered to only be a part of the US total national defense spending. The Biden administration already made budget predictions for defense spending up to year 2034, and each year the predictions change to align with the current year's actual spending, including the existing 2025 budget. In those statistics, the 2025 budget was not listed as $849 billion, as the US Department of Defense statement suggests, but actually $921 billion. The difference stems from the fact that the $849 billion was actually only discretionary US Department of Defense spending, listed under subfunction 051. The actual national defense budget includes other metrics. These include 053 for atomic energy defense activities, which used up another $34 billion, and other defense-related activities bundled under subfunction 054, which amounted to $11.5 billion. Furthermore, the budget also calls for mandatory spending for all three subfunctions, which totals around $26 billion for the 2025 fiscal year. So the actual defense spending for 2025 was already approaching the $1 trillion mark. Furthermore, the predictions from the Biden administration, made in 2024, imply that the total national defense spending would surpass $1 trillion as early as 2029, just 3 years later than what Trump is proposing. This leaves us with three different lenses through which to view Trump's proposal. First, Trump could mean that the total national defense spending would hit $1 trillion in 2026. This would effectively ignore the $849 billion listed budget for 2025 and count the total $921 billion figure instead. As such, the budget would only be $50 billion higher than the predicted 2026 figure of $950 billion, presenting a much more modest and doable 5% increase in spending. However, there's the aforementioned possibility that the number does refer to only the $849 billion budget and results in a 17% increase from 2025. This is supported by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth tagging the Pentagon in response over the social media platform X to confirm that the announcement could have actual ramifications for the government. The Pentagon is the sole recipient of the Function 050 budget, but it doesn't technically confirm this option. The third possibility is that the announcement refers to the total discretionary budget for national defense, which includes the previously mentioned subfunctions 053 and 054. Biden administration projections for the discretionary budget for 2026 were $924 billion, so the increase would be just over 8%, a figure that some US budget analysts suggest could be doable with some rounding and moderate growth. So which of these options are most likely to be correct? Hegseth also gave a somewhat vague hint. Every dollar will be spent wisely on lethality and readiness. Translation: expect a sharp focus on combat power and weapons procurement, not administrative bloat. If the administration sticks to prior trends, this means major contracts for missile defense, next-gen fighters, nuclear modernization, cyber capabilities, and new space-based systems. Let's separate those figures from the listed budget. In 2025, procurement accounted for $167 billion, research and development for another $143 billion, and land power modernization, including Army and Marine Corps equipment, received $13 billion. A suggested $50 billion increase under the first option going directly to these three segments would constitute a 15% increase within a single year, making it an ambitious improvement in US military readiness and active procurement. But let's go into the deeper end with some of the proposed military programs that are most ambitious and tenable to receive huge injections of funding. One of the flashiest programs likely to get a boost is the so-called Golden Dome. This is a proposed space-based missile defense shield modeled after elements of Israel's Iron Dome, but scaled to intercept hypersonic and intercontinental threats. It's an ambitious system that would require satellites, AI-assisted targeting, and high-orbit interceptors to change the previous ground-based systems to space-bound ones. The Golden Dome was first proposed in response to growing concerns over advanced missile threats, including China's test of a nuclear-capable hypersonic glide vehicle that briefly entered low Earth orbit before re-entering the atmosphere. In theory, such systems could evade traditional missile detection for much of their trajectory, giving the US far less warning and reaction time than with a conventional intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM. The Golden Dome therefore aims to bridge that gap in detection and interception, offering an added layer of security by positioning elements of the system in orbit rather than solely relying on ground-based assets. This might not sound important, but it would drastically increase the energy requirements of trying to remove US defensive systems. This is due to the astronomical differences between launching a missile for a suborbital flight path, such as an ICBM, and a truly orbital one, with the latter being between 4 and 10 times as energy intensive in terms of fuel requirements. This would make any country wanting to take on the US need its own orbital launch systems to compete, which will put a lot more strain on its economy. The Trump announcement came with immediate reports that the Golden Dome is feasible given the underlying technology already exists. The Missile Defense Agency and the Space Development Agency have been developing the hypersonic and ballistic tracking space sensor system, which has already demonstrated capabilities in tracking hypersonic threats and would likely be used as the base for the dome. Defense contractors including Lockheed Martin, RTX, and Northrop Grumman are also exploring how their existing technologies can contribute to the Golden Dome. For instance, Lockheed Martin is considering the integration of its command and control networks and radar systems into the project. Additionally, companies like Blue Halo suggest that the Golden Dome could be expanded to cover broader defense capabilities, such as counter-drone systems and electronic warfare, to address a wider range of threats. While the US administration has not provided a cost estimate for the Golden Dome initiative, defense budget experts anticipate it could potentially cost tens of billions of dollars over the next decade. This would slot nicely into the proposed budget increase that Trump has alluded to. However, critics say that the dome is decades away from viability because while the building blocks of the technology and launch systems are there, integrating them into an entire system could take years or even decades. On the other hand, supporters argue the dome could end up as an essential deterrence against near-peer adversaries like China, especially given the pivotal 2021 test launching. But the dollar signs don't stop at missile defense. Conventional military equipment, such as airplanes and ships, are also possibly included. A pivotal example is the B-21 Raider stealth bomber. The B-21 Raider is the US Air Force's next-generation stealth bomber, developed by Northrop Grumman to replace the aging B-1 and B-2 fleets. Designed for both conventional and nuclear missions, the B-21 is a pivotal component of the US military's strategic modernization efforts. To illustrate the B-21's potential, the US Air Force has already proposed fielding at least 100 of the aircraft in 30 years, with more ambitious predictions of landing at around 200 aircraft. By comparison, the US only has 19 B-2 bombers. This is due to the drastically reduced implementation cost of the B-21, which will be a little under a third of what the B-2 initially cost to produce. The planned fleet of 100 aircraft is estimated to cost $203 billion, including research and testing. However, a big constraint in building a fleet of B-21s remains production capacity, with current capabilities limited to only around 10 aircraft per year. Therefore, if a large cut of the budget increase would go to the B-21 development, it would allow the US to not only field more of them in their fleet, but get that fleet much sooner than expected. This would also directly lower the per-unit cost of the aircraft, as it's calculated based on the total cost of research, development, and production than divided by the number of units built, which would make the program far more appealing to Congress and Senate who decide on budget allocations in the first place. However, the war in Ukraine underlined yet another avenue of warfare in which the US might be lagging: drones. Sure, the US has some of the most sophisticated and reliable long-range drones, such as the famous MQ-9 Reaper, but those drones come with million-dollar price tags attached to them. And while the US hasn't shied away from using drones in both offensive and surveillance operations, these come with significant opportunity and operational costs. It doesn't make economic sense to use a multi-million-dollar drone to bomb a shack in the Middle East that houses a piece of aging anti-air equipment that can cost as little as $2,000. Instead, the US could take the lessons learned by Ukraine in developing a more cost-effective drone fleet to leverage its asymmetric warfare. Even better for the US, Ukraine has pioneered those same drones and is working with various European countries to create mutually beneficial research. It would allow the US to further its long-range reach by reducing its reliance on long logistical chains, starting in the mainland, instead relying on agile and mobile workshops to churn out drones on demand. There's another element we can't ignore: nuclear modernization. The US is in the middle of replacing all three legs of its nuclear triad: ICBMs, strategic bombers, and submarine-launched missiles. The US Air Force is replacing the Minuteman III ICBMs, first deployed in 1970, with the LGM-35 Sentinel system. The program includes modernizing 450 silos and over 600 facilities across approximately 40,000 square miles. To replace the aging Ohio-class submarines, the US Navy is developing the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines. These submarines will provide enhanced stealth capabilities and are expected to enter service in the early 2030s. The Columbia-class program is a critical component of the sea-based leg of the nuclear triad, ensuring a survivable second strike capability. The aforementioned B-21 will be capable of delivering both conventional and nuclear payloads and is expected to enter service in the mid-2020s. Additionally, the long-range standoff missile is being developed to replace the aging AGM-86B air-launched cruise missile, providing the B-21 with a modern nuclear cruise missile capability. These programs are staggeringly expensive, with the Congressional Budget Office estimating a $756 billion price tag over the next decade. Trump's budget could push these projects further and faster, especially the Sentinel ICBM program and Columbia-class submarines. But while the administration points to China and Russia as justifications for these investments, there's a larger geopolitical game at play, and it's closer to home: NATO. Trump's relationship with NATO has always been transactional. During his first term, he berated allies for not meeting the agreed-upon recommendations of a 2% GDP defense spending benchmark. Now he's calling on NATO countries to more than double that, to 5%. He argues the US shoulders too much of the global security burden and that Europe must pay its fair share if the alliance is to remain viable. It's a provocative stance, and it comes at a time when many NATO members are only just beginning to meet their original commitments. According to NATO's 2024 report, just 11 of the alliance's 31 members were spending 2% or more of GDP on defense in 2023. Germany, which only recently reversed decades of underinvestment, is still ramping up slowly. Italy, Spain, and Belgium remain well below target. However, there was notable progress in all these regards. Military budgets for 2024 suggested that 23 out of the 31 members reached the recommended expenditure, with some of them going above 3% to get more in line with the US spending, which is around 3.36%. Furthermore, NATO was technically an active part of the war on terror, sending troops to the Middle East to assist the US forces, which was only brought on by the US invoking Article 5 for the first and only time so far in history. Asking these countries to more than double defense spending will not only face political resistance, it could fracture alliance cohesion. Some European officials fear Trump's hardline posture is less about burden sharing and more about setting the stage to justify a US pullback. If NATO members don't pay up, the implication goes, the US might reduce troop levels or withdraw support in a crisis. That's a risky game, because while a larger US military might look impressive on paper, it doesn't mean much if its credibility as a global partner erodes. There's also the economic reality. A $1 trillion defense budget adds pressure to a federal government already grappling with ballooning deficits. The national debt crossed $34 trillion in early 2024. Interest payments alone now outpace the entire defense budget. Unless Trump's team can offset this new spending with deep cuts elsewhere, in healthcare, education, and social security, the numbers don't add up. And even if those cuts are made, the political backlash would be fierce. So where's the money supposed to come from? Trump alluded to savings founded by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, but offered no details. The likeliest targets? Civilian federal agencies and domestic programs, many of which have already seen cuts during his previous term. That could set off another round of partisan warfare in Congress, with Democrats warning of gutting the safety net, while Republicans double down on prioritizing national defense. And there's another more likely option: trade tariffs. In late March, Trump shocked the world by announcing a slew of trade tariffs on dozens of nations that he perceived were imposing their own tariffs on the US. In truth, the US simply had a trade deficit with most of those nations, meaning that it imported more goods from them than it exported to them. Regardless, collecting higher tariffs would directly give the government more money to play with. Furthermore, you have to remember that DOGE is headed by none other than billionaire Elon Musk, who has one of the highest net worths in the world. Now, if you followed some of Trump's other announcements, you might remember his proposals for changing the US tax laws. Among those was his suggestion of abolishing the tax for people who earn less than $150,000 a year, but the plan was never actually expanded on. A more detailed analysis of the previous 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is now about to enter the Senate and Congress, showed that the new tax laws arguably benefit the rich more, with about a 3.2% tax cut compared to the only 1.3% cut the average household could see. So the taxes would be directly working against the proposed increased military spending, which would only lead to more tariffs in the long run. If that happens, other countries will impose their own tariffs on the US, as China already did multiple times in response to Trump-issued tariffs. The only option for Trump would then be to reverse course on either the tariffs or taxes or both, which would destabilize the entire US economy. But even if we disregard the economics of the process, the defense industry itself has some concerns. Former Pentagon officials warn that throwing money at the military doesn't always lead to better outcomes. Readiness depends on strategy, not just spending. In recent years, the military has struggled with outdated procurement processes, cost overruns, and bureaucratic delays. The F-35 program remains a poster child for this, costing taxpayers over $1.7 trillion to date with persistent performance issues. If new funding isn't paired with reform, it risks feeding the same inefficient machine. And then there's recruitment. The military has missed its recruiting goals for multiple years. The military was short nearly 15,000 recruits in 2022. Gen Z is proving hard to reach, skeptical of the situation, wary of long deployments, and drawn to private sector tech jobs that pay better with less risk. Money alone won't solve that. Building a force that reflects the next generation's values, including purpose, flexibility, and innovation, will take more than just bigger paychecks. This raises a deeper question. Is the $1 trillion number about actual defense needs, or is it political theater? It's not the first time Trump has floated a massive number. In his first term, he routinely exaggerated defense investments, claiming to have rebuilt the military when many programs were simply continuations of Obama-era plans. This time, the stakes are higher. Trump is campaigning on strength, a strong economy, a strong border, a strong military. The trillion-dollar number is a symbol of that brand. Whether it translates into tangible change is another story. Let's also consider the global signal it sends. To rivals like China and Russia, it may reinforce the image of the US as a military-first power, one preparing for conflict rather than diplomacy. That perception could drive an arms race, not prevent one. China is already ramping up military spending, with its 2025 defense budget projected at approximately $249 billion, up from $230 billion just 2 years ago. Russia, despite economic sanctions, continues to prioritize military modernization. Even North Korea is testing advanced missile systems at an accelerating pace. And what about allies in the Indo-Pacific? Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Australia are watching closely. A bigger US budget could reassure them of America's commitment, or it could prompt them to hedge, increasing their defenses while pursuing more independent security paths. The Philippines, for instance, recently re-invited US troops in response to China's aggression in the South China Sea, but it also signed new security pacts with India and Japan, a sign that multipolar balancing is already in motion. In the Middle East, where Trump made his announcement, the implications are different. Israel, the closest US ally in the region, will likely benefit from increased military aid and joint development programs. This includes missile defense collaborations and intelligence sharing on Iran's nuclear ambitions. But at the same time, America's deeper military entrenchment could draw it further into regional conflicts, especially if tensions with Iran escalate or if conflicts in Syria and Lebanon reignite. Trump has already made a partial commitment by creating a bombardment campaign against the Houthis that utilize not one but 2 aircraft carriers and their fleets. So where does all this leave us? With a bigger, costlier military, with allies under pressure, with rivals recalibrating, and with a domestic political system bracing for the fallout of massive federal reallocation while being increasingly isolated from erratic economic decisions made to aggravate rather than pacify. The $1 trillion budget is more than a number, it's a test of America's priorities. Trump's budget might pass, or it might be whittled down by a skeptical Congress. But one thing is clear, the debate it sparks will shape the future of US defense policy, NATO cohesion, and global stability for years to come. And that's the real trillion-dollar question. But what do you think? Will Trump's proposals ever approach reality, or will the 2026 military budget be more down to earth and ignore the posturing? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out how powerful is the US military. or click this other video instead.